For everyone that's registered, it's just easier to send this as a default. And if you don't want to look at this email or open these things, you don't have to. This video recording will be available on the Housing Task Force's YouTube page, where all of our previous monthly recordings are available. And I will also circulate the presentations that are available tonight. So if there's something on a PowerPoint that really inspired you or caught your eye, you'll be able to look at that on your own time in the upcoming days and weeks ahead. So the three presenters tonight, two of whom are members of the Housing Task Force Advisory Board. That's Adam from Pattern for Progress and Mike from Rural Housing Coalition, have been incredibly valuable members of that advisory board and just really incredibly important counsel to me as I try to kind of navigate Columbia County's housing issues, which are deep and broad, but so has the response. The response has been deep and broad as well. And Darren Scott from HCR, I've been lucky enough to know for just about a decade now, going back to some work that we did in our previously shared stomping grounds of Troy, just up the river a little bit. So a lot of the work that the task force has been doing is based on work that Adam's organization, Pattern for Progress, has produced over the past few years. And Pattern does a really good job of collecting data and then putting that into a context that not only makes sense, but also inspires solutions. So we'll hear first from Adam about current trends. There have been a few reports that Pattern has published since the Housing Brief and the Housing Forum last year that deal with demographic trends as well as housing trends and how the two are interrelated. We'll hear from Mike Borges regarding the legislative agenda of the Rural Housing Coalition, what they hope to achieve in 2024, and also some recent achievements that have been made in the areas in which the RHC works. We'll also hear about what exactly is a rural preservation company and what can they do for the county. And then we'll hear from Darren about best practices from around the state of various state programs, how they've been rolled out in communities throughout the region and throughout all of New York State. So those are best practices that we can learn really good examples from and then put into place here locally. So I'm going to turn it over to Adam. And again, if you have any questions about anything that comes up, please put them into Q&A. We'll get to as many of them as possible after the presentations. Take it away, Adam.
Right. Thanks, Chris. I'm gonna share my screen with everyone. I have a pretty brief presentation, but I'm gonna run through it at the speed of light so that I keep to my 10 minutes, Chris. I'm very cognizant of time. So what I'm going to walk through tonight is a little bit of information about demographics and a little bit of information about housing and try to connect the two so that you can see how they're affecting the economy region-wide. We put out a report earlier this year called The Great People Shortage and Its Effects on the Hudson Valley. It was a report that looked at demographic trends and the way it's shaping our workforce in the region. And it starts with this. So this blue line up here on the top right, this blue dotted line is what's called the replacement birth rate. This is the number of children that families need to have to keep our population perfectly flat. And what you can see here is we have a global trend that is going toward population decline. All the major industrialized countries across the globe are now under that replacement birth rate. Here in New York, that replacement birth rate is at 2.1. We're at 1.55 children per family. So we are now well below that replacement birth rate, which means that long-term we here in New York are headed toward a future of population decline, absent influence from some other outside factor. You can see in Columbia County, compare the number of annual births 97 until 2019, down about 27-28% in terms of births in the county. That's consistent with most places in the Hudson Valley. The only places that are outliers are places that have full-time Orthodox Jewish communities. They're having children at a much higher rate than the general population. You take those populations out of Orange County, out of Rockland County, out of Sullivan County, and statistically those counties then match up with all the other counties that surround them. Of course, our births are feedstock for our school populations, so no surprise, we see school populations really diving everywhere across the region. You can draw a line at the Great Recession of 2008 and see a substantial difference. So before 2008, which is on the left, you could essentially draw a line at Route 84 and essentially say everything north of 84 was shrinking, everything south of 84 was either flat or slightly growing. But that's not the case post-Great Recession. Post-Great Recession, We have 5 entire counties where every single school district is shrinking. We have 2 counties where all the school districts are shrinking except 1 or 2. And then we have some to the south where there's maybe 3, 4, 5 that are growing and the rest are essentially flat. In the aggregate, we've lost 34,088 students in our schools since the peak in 2005. 97 of our 120 school districts have shrinking enrollments at this point. And in Columbia County, your districts are all down just in the past 15 years by 30% or more. Think about what that means. In just 15 years, 1 out of every 3 kids who was in your school is no longer there. That's pretty significant. You match that up with migration. So migration is not the term you've been hearing in the news. This migration means domestic migration. It's the movement of people state to state and county to county across the United States. Our region, we've been net losers when it comes to migration over the past 25 years. We've lost 134,505 people on a net basis to outward migration. Now, most of those people, there's always a steady flow between our region and New York City, but absent that, most of our people who are leaving the region are going to one of 2 places. They're either going just over the border to the neighboring counties, so that would be places like Fairfield, Connecticut, Berkshire County, Massachusetts, on the other side of the valley, over to Pike County, Pennsylvania, Bergen County, New Jersey, or they're going now to essentially the Carolinas and Florida with a little bit of a signal to Georgia. If you were to look at these data 5-10 years ago, there was a very strong signal out west, people moving from our region out west, that has essentially died off. There's actually more of a signal now, people from the west returning east. So it's an interesting sort of fluid situation to watch. You guys are a little bit different than the region in Columbia County. You've gained a net number of people to migration for pretty much all of the last 5 or 6 years. The numbers are relatively small, but as a proportional basis, you've gained 4 out of the last 6 years. The numbers are small, but on a proportional basis, you can feel an extra 700 people in Columbia County. Similar to Greene, you can feel an extra 500 people in Greene County. In a bigger county to the south, you might not notice that, but certainly it makes a difference in a place like Columbia County. Your biggest source of inflow, no surprise, has been New York City. In just 2 years, you essentially gained 2,500 people on a net basis from New York City. This has real ramifications on our workforce. We're here talking about housing, talking about economic development. The intersection of housing and economic development is workforce. Do you have housing to sustain and retain a workforce?
Yes. Yeah. What does your mom and my dad say about candy? Okay, yeah. It's just
Melba, you got to mute.
Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry.
I say yes to candy, by the way. I have a whole bunch of it on my desk. Okay.
I apologize.
So that's okay. So we look through the demographics at different levels of ages. Okay. What do we see? What we see is a significant incongruity in the regional workforce that is going to create more workforce stress in the region than we are feeling now. And we know that we're feeling it now. Most of our hospital systems are hiring nurses on contracts from outside the region. We've had school districts shut down entire bus routes because they can't find drivers. We have, shipping and logistics centers that are trying to hire people but can't find them. We have lots of restaurants with signs up at the window saying, please pardon be patient with us because we have fewer staff. So what we see here is if you take the prime labor cohort and you break it in half, the older half outnumbers the younger half by almost exactly 100,000 people. What that means functionally is that as the baby boomer generation begins to retire in larger numbers, for every person that retires, you only have a fraction of a person replacing them in the labor pool. So that means that our workforce stress gets more difficult over time. It also, if you look at it, it's going to get worse because of the number of infants, children, and teens is going down. These numbers show the number of infants, children, and teens that were in the region in 2010 and in the region in 2021. The number of kids under the age of 5 is down by almost 5,000 people. Number of kids 5 to 9 is down by almost 12,000. Number of kids 10 to 14 is down by 4,500. Number of kids 15 to 19 is down by another 5,000. You add that up, we have 26,000 fewer kids in our neighborhoods than we did just 11 years ago on a 2010 to 2021 basis. This has big ramifications on our schools, on our future workforce, on our volunteer base, and on our community vibrancy. So we need to see this challenge with eyes wide open and really put this along with housing at the top of our civic to-do list. I'm not going to go through this in much detail, but suffice to say that these demographic trends have big ramifications for our economy in terms of labor shortages, upward wage pressure, business closures. When you have a baby boomer generation person who owned your classic Main Street business, like a dry cleaner, like a diner, like an auto repair shop, if they can't find someone to pass that along to, we're seeing more and more of them start to liquidate. Stressor for business attraction. It's hard to attract businesses if we can't show that we have an ample workforce to supply. Fewer consumers, right? Fewer people means fewer consumers. And there are equally vexing challenges related to schools, healthcare, general societal issues, taxing and municipal finance, and transportation. One that I'll just take a minute to point out is the healthcare one. This is a particularly challenging time in healthcare, not only for financial reasons, but as the region ages, the demand for healthcare services is going up, just at the same time that the number of people available to work in the healthcare industry is going down. So that is creating this tension within the healthcare systems that they're having to essentially counterbalance by hiring, especially nurses from outside the region. There's also serious shortages in primary care physicians and other fields within the broader medical field. So just moving on to housing, I don't think I have to tell all of you, you've been concentrating on this issue along with Chris for quite some time now. But really since 2018, the cost of housing has far outpaced our neighbors' ability to afford it. And just starting with a look at median sale prices, right? The cost of home ownership has sprinted away from people much faster than they can catch up to it. Most recent data that we just got last week, median sale price in Columbia County for the last quarter was $465,000 on a single family home. That's a pretty significant increase. That's probably, if you factor that in here, that's more than 75% increase from where you were in 2018. Inventory of homes is also low. These are annualized data. You have about, 1/3 of the homes on the market now, maybe a little more than 1/3 than you had in 2018. That again, we have this crisis that's both affordability and availability. Prices are too high and the available stock is not plentiful enough. This extends to rental housing. So we did put out a brand new report last month, our Out of Reach 2023 report. And one of the things that we looked at was, how much people would have to make to afford rents in the region. And remember, when we talk about affordable, the standard is that, right, people are cost burdened if they're spending more than 30% of their income on housing, okay? Whether it's home ownership, rentals, at every spectrum of income, we want to try to see that people are not spending more than 30% of their income on housing. In order to do that in Columbia County, your average renter would need to make about $18.50 in per hour in income. You're making about $13.22, so you're about $5 off from meeting that metric with your renters. That means that renters are cost burdened. It means that they don't have as much money left over at the end of the day to afford other goods and services that they either need or want. I'll just mention one other thing that's not on this slide, and it's in our report. I'm happy to share the link with everybody. We also did an analysis for the first time of the affordability of home ownership. And the way we did that is we took the median wages for the typical family in each county, and we calculated out the mortgage that they would qualify for at the median wage for a family. We then took the median price of a home and back calculated the mortgage that you would need to afford that home. And the gap in every county is more than 100,000. It's more than 200,000 in Columbia County between the mortgage that people would qualify for and the mortgage they would need to afford a median home. So that's a very big gap. One of the things we've been saying is that the pathway to home from rentals to home ownership across the region is essentially shut down. That's especially true in a place like Columbia County. What that means is that more of your neighbors are persisting in rentals for longer and longer and longer. That means they can own a piece of the community they live in. It means they can make those equity gains that have been important to generations of Americans in terms of wealth building. So reestablishing that missing rung on the ladder, that graduation pathway from rentals to home ownership, is a really important goal of any effective housing plan, whether it's through a land bank or through habitat or through thinking about zoning that encourages different models of home ownership. This is my last slide. Of course, we talk about housing as a challenge. I think it's just important to keep our eyes on a broad view. Our ability to afford housing is also based on the other costs that are affecting young families at the family formulation stage. Because traditionally in our country, you've bought a home around the same time you have your first kid, around the time you're climbing a job ladder. But right now, there's more costs on those people than there typically has been in the past. Between childcare and college debt alone, the typical young family with two college-educated earners is spending about $2,400 a month just on childcare and college debt alone. That makes it really difficult to save for down payment and closing costs on a home. It's just another factor that means more of our neighbors are likely to persist in rentals for longer. Not saying that's good, not saying that's bad. Some people want to be in rentals, and that's fine. But we would like to reopen that pathway to home ownership for those who would like to do it. I think I stuck to my 10 minutes, Chris. I hope I'll leave it at that and stick around to answer questions as people have them.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Adam. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing that link too. I would love to see that, the formula for the affordability. And again, if you've got any questions for Adam, feel free to pop them in Q&A. We'll also open it up to questions later on if there aren't enough in Q&A to make it worth our while, I suppose, to answer. Next up is going to be Mike Borges, the Executive Director of the Rural Housing Coalition. Mike, along with Darren, are one of two folks who I've interacted with the past few months who are as much responsible for Columbia County's land bank application as anybody else. And Mike is going to talk to us about what the RHC has been up to and what they hope to be up to next year.
Great. Thanks, Chris, for that introduction. Well, glad to be here. The Rural Housing Coalition is a statewide organization established in 1979 to represent rural housing and community development organizations. For example, the Columbia Economic Development Organization that Chris belongs to is a member, and Galvin in housing is also a member. Hudson River Housing, just south of you guys, are members as well. There are currently 58 of these rural preservation companies that are spread across rural New York, and they provide a variety of housing services. Sorry, just do that. So what we do is we provide housing counseling services to first-time homebuyers, foreclosure prevention, rehab, repair, construction of affordable housing, both rental and owner-occupied. We do Section 8 voucher administration. We manage moderate, low to moderate income affordable housing for seniors as well. And we do mobile home replacement and repair. We do accessibility modifications for the disabled and seniors. So like if your grandma has a leaking roof or a broken boiler and it needs emergency repair, you can call upon a rural preservation company, a local nonprofit housing, to do that work for you. Or if you have a disabled veteran who needs a wheelchair ramp installed on their house, that's something that, again, rural preservation companies do with state funding that they apply for. We also do Main Street and downtown revitalization, as well as weatherization. So in your area, in the Columbia County area, Galvin located in Hudson, there's Catskill Mountain Housing across the river in Catskill. Further down the road there's in Kingston, there's Rubco. So there are areas, there are rural preservation companies located in your area. They're actually going to be expanding the number of RPCs from 58 to 60. We got some additional funding in the recent state budget to increase the number of RPCs as well as the admin funding that goes to them. So there's going to be their HCR is going to be doing an RFP hopefully before the end of the year to fill two vacant spots. And Columbia County could be one, or, Northern Dutchess is another possibility. But, there's an opportunity to increase the number of RPCs in the state. How does HCR define rural? So they define rural as 25,000 or less in population. And there are currently 34 counties in the state with the population, with 100% of the population considered rural. There are 46 counties with the majority of the population considered rural. And then 72% of the housing in rural communities is owner occupied. And a lot of that, 57%, majority of it was built before 1970, and 35% was built before 1940. Two of the issues that we're going to be focusing on going forward with our legislative advocacy is the preservation of what they call USDA 515 properties. So USDA is the Department of Agriculture. They funded back in the 1990s and early 2000s a boom in construction of affordable rental housing in rural communities across New York, across the country, actually. And in New York, we have about 400 of these USDA 515 properties. Their 30-year mortgages are coming to expire. And once their mortgages expire, they lose their affordability protections. So there is some substantial potential for many of these apartments that are now affordable to go to market rate or to be transformed into something else. So that's a major concern for us. The other thing we worked on was mobile homes, mobile home parks. There are about 1,800 mobile home parks in the state. According to the last consensus that HCR did back in 2019, unfortunately, they transferred the ownership of the registration of mobile home parks to Tax and Finance in 2020. And since then, according to the latest information from Tax and Finance, there are only, I think, about 1,200 mobile home parks. So somehow we lost 600 mobile home parks, or Tax and Finance hasn't been doing its job and registering the mobile home parks in the state.
Hey, Mike.
Yes.
Your slides are still on your title slide.
Oh, I'm sorry. Not sure why that's happening. Okay, let me do that again. Let's see. Can you see this?
Yes, sir.
Okay, sorry. Where was I? We talked about the population. We talked about the challenges now. So some of the challenges that we found in dealing with rural communities across the state is the capacity of many local rural governments and as well as nonprofits in applying for and accessing and obtaining funding to do housing. The other obstacle is either non-existent or outdated zoning regulations, or the lack of a comprehensive plan or a housing needs assessment. Fortunately, Columbia County actually has a very recent housing needs assessment that was done. A lot of the other stumbling blocks is a lack of infrastructure like water, sewer, and broadband. Again, rural communities tend to have an older housing stock, which means housing stock that is in more disrepair or vacant. And then again, we have two sources of affordable housing. One is owner occupied, which is mobile home parks, which are in danger of being lost through speculation, investors coming in and buying up a mobile home park and turning it into something else like marinas or high-end developments. And then we also are in danger of losing our USDA 515 properties, as I said, because their mortgages are expiring and we're in danger of losing the affordability. Again, we don't have a lot of or many state programs that are targeted to rural communities other than the RPP program, which funds the rural preservation companies and rural rental assistance that goes to the USDA 515 properties to make them affordable. There are no real dedicated funding streams for the construction of affordable housing in rural communities. And so we're hoping to address that going forward. This is just a map that shows you where mobile home parks are located. As you can see, there are 3 counties in the immediate area, Capital Region and Hudson Valley. Saratoga, Ulster, and Dutchess have the most mobile home parks in the state, and Columbia County is not too far behind. Chris alluded to earlier that we had some progress recently with mobile home parks. We had released a study back in June, which highlighted the need of mobile home parks and the role that mobile home parks and manufactured housing in general can play in addressing the affordable housing crisis. And we called for several changes to laws and regulations that would preserve more mobile home parks. Last week, the governor signed 3 pieces of legislation, one of them that we suggested in our report that would make it easier for the residents of mobile home parks to purchase their own parks when they become available for sale. So the current law allowed first right of refusal. So when a mobile home park owner wanted to sell his property, if there was a change of use, the residents of the mobile home park were allowed to make a bid on the property. That was very limiting. So this law that we just got signed into law last week expands that to when there's just a change of ownership. So anytime the mobile home park owner is intending to sell his property, he has to give the residents of that mobile home park the ability or the opportunity to bid on that property and buy it for themselves. Now that can be a big stumbling block for residents of a mobile home park. So there's more work to be done. Again, we want to be able to have the residents assign the opportunity to purchase to it like a nonprofit. So a nonprofit could buy the mobile home park and preserve it as affordable housing on their behalf. And we also want to make some, adjustments to that. So that way there's more time for the residents to put together an offer and things like that. But there was progress. And we commend the governor for signing the legislation, and we're glad our small report was able to influence that decision making. And again, as I mentioned earlier, USDA 515 properties are significant. We probably have one of the largest concentration of USDA 515 properties in the country in New York. There's 400 of them, encompassing 22,000 affordable rental housing units. So that's significant. And we need to do more. Other states like Maine, Washington State, I think Oregon, have programs dedicated, state programs dedicated to preserving these affordable housing in rural communities. And that's what we're going to be asking for in the upcoming legislative session, is among other things, asking for a dedicated funding stream to support the acquisition as well as the rehabilitation of these properties. A lot of these properties, again, are over 30 years old. And so they're in need of repair and rehabilitation. And we need a dedicated funding stream to preserve what we currently have. From my perspective, I don't think we're going to be able to build our way out of our housing crisis. Building new is part of the solution, but preserving what we have in place is also part of the solution. And we need to do more to preserve what we have, whether they're mobile home parks, mobile homes, or these USDA 515 properties. So going forward, again, we're going to request that the state continue its funding for the Rural Preservation Program, again, which is one of the few dedicated programs in the state geared towards helping rural communities with their housing needs. Not last year, 2 years ago, we got funding for a small rental development initiative. It's called SARDI. And it was targeted and actually based on Columbia County's housing needs assessment, which said that they could only build up to 18 units, that your infrastructure can only accommodate up to 18 units of rental housing. So we incorporated that into our proposal, and the legislature funded the Small Rental Development Initiative at $7 million, which goes towards the construction and rehabilitation of affordable rental housing of 5 to 20 units. So again, we're hoping to double that to 14 this past last fall to summer when they did their first RFP. They got 11 applications. The HCR at the state got 11 applications for $14 million worth of projects. So that's why we're asking for 14 million. Again, we're also asking for more flexibility with current programs that fund mobile home replacement. Because right now, you're limited to what you can use the money for rehabbing, repairing, or replacing mobile homes outside of parks is easier than it is in mobile home parks, but we need to do more to preserve those as well. We also want some money to help nonprofits acquire mobile home parks from their owners. Again, if we're able to change the law to allow the assignment of the right to purchase from the residents of a mobile home park to a nonprofit, we can do more to preserve these mobile home parks as an affordable housing option. But there needs to be more money to do that. Again, we want to create a stable funding stream for the preservation of these USDA 515 properties. Another thing is lacking, I guess, in state government is that under Governor Mario Cuomo, there used to be an Office of Rural Affairs, sort of like an ombudsman, a point person in state government where rural communities could go and help navigate the bureaucracy of state government, the alphabet soup of HCR and ESD and DEC and whatever. So we've been calling for the refunding of that that office in the executive chamber, so that way rural communities have someplace to go who can help coordinate applications, coordinate meetings, just be a sort of an ombudsman for rural communities, which is lacking. And then the last thing, we're looking for infrastructure. Most of, not all of the state housing programs don't fund infrastructure. So if you're building a housing development, the roads and sewer and all that, you have to come up with other sources of funding for it. So the governor was right when she proposed in this past year's budget, $250 million for infrastructure. Unfortunately, that, as well as the 20 million she asked for planning, never made it into a final budget. We supported both. They were good ideas. We still think they're good ideas. And we're hoping that the governor again proposes both money for the infrastructure as well as for planning that would help pay for these housing needs assessments. So that's all I have to say. And I'm open up to any questions if there's time.
Yeah, I think what we'll do is we'll bring Darren. Thank you, Mike. And then we'll bring Darren in next, and then I'll open it up to questions for the three presenters before I do my little spiel about what we've done, building on the work that you guys really kind of provided the impetus for, a lot of the things that we're doing throughout the county. So I'll turn it over to Darren now, and then once Darren's done, we'll go through questions from the audience. Mr. Scott.
All right, thank you, Chris. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Super. Good evening, everyone. Glad to be back. Thank you for the invitation. Always glad to talk to Columbia County. I'm Darren Scott. I'm the Upstate East Development Director for New York State Homes and Community Renewal. I've been with the agency for almost 7 years, but I've been working in affordable housing for over 30. And my territory is everything north of Westchester and Rockland County up to the Canadian border and out to, but not including Syracuse. So I'm based in Albany and live in Troy. So you're right in my sweet spot. Often visit Hudson and places in Columbia County. What do? I have 1 foot in the agency, 1 foot outside the agency. So I do a lot of visiting of communities, working with local leaders and stakeholders to talk about affordable housing and try to identify their housing needs and come up with solutions. The other part is more internal, where I help to develop housing programs and implement them, get the money out the door. A quick intro or re-intro to HCR. HCR is the state's housing finance agency, and it's actually 5 agencies under a single umbrella. Each of those agencies does something different in the affordable housing space. And but primarily we're a finance agency. So we do not own, we do not develop, we don't manage affordable and supportive housing, but we provide the resources to very capable developers and nonprofit housing providers who carry out that mission throughout New York State. And a big part of that is, again, the nonprofits, the rural preservation corporations and the neighborhood improvement corporations, to which HCR gives a modest administrative fee to offer services in those communities, but they can also avail themselves of capital dollars, and I'll get them into that a little bit later. A growing portion of our business is being done through mom and pops and what I call the uninitiated small developers, meaning these are folks who are out in the community buying properties and investing in their communities, but haven't used state resources in order to do so. And so more and more people are hearing about the programs that the state has to offer. I'm going to say this again and again, it's an all hands on deck situation in New York State. And so, you know, while most of our business is carried out by developers who are familiar with our programs, had success with our programs, and those nonprofits, more and more of the activity is being done by folks like you who see a building or see a vacant lot in your community. You know the housing situation in your community and you want to do something about it. So we want to be able to deputize you with the knowledge and the resources in order for you to act. So my agenda, I'm going to throw a lot of information out at you very quickly, but rest assured you can access that information and myself through Chris. But I want to touch on two primary things. One is pro-housing communities. There's been a lot of talk about that. Plus, I want to frame the conversation about best practices in terms of the funding that is available. And then perhaps if there are questions about utilization of those funds, we can talk about that in terms of best practices. Everybody I think is familiar with the governor's housing compact. It was a big agenda item in the last budget, did not pass. That did not deter the governor, so she is taking action on her own through her own authority through an executive order to prioritize discretionary funding towards communities that want more housing and more housing growth. So pro-housing, essentially, it gives communities who want to grow and answer to their housing needs priority access to a slate of resources. Those resources, I'll just tick off a few. The Downtown Revitalization Initiative, this tends to work mostly in larger communities, but it's a smaller version, New York Forward. I could see applying to several places in Columbia County. If you're not familiar, this is a planning grant that has quite a lot of implementation money behind it to seed priority projects in your communities. Housing being one of them, but there are economic development initiatives, street improvement initiatives, public art initiatives, a wide variety of things. One of the programs that is administered through HCR is the New York Main Street program, where that's essentially activating upper story residential units that may be dormant, and also revitalizing the storefronts. And also you can include a key or anchor project in your community, a property that may be a blighting building that's historic, that's beautiful, that is an asset that has a lot of history to it for the community, but that it's economically infeasible to put back to productive use without deep subsidy from the state. So I'm just going to read through some material on how you apply. So municipalities must submit an application to HCR to be designated as a pro-housing community. Municipalities can start the process by sending a letter of intent from an authorized official to the program email. That's the start. Next, all applicants will fill out templates provided below in this material to document and verify local zoning codes and information detailing local housing permit approvals over the past 5 years. So this can be done in two ways. Permits, you can prove that your permits increasing their housing stock by 1% in your locality, or permits increasing their housing stock by 3% or 1% downstate, 1% upstate over the past 3 years. Or for localities that have not seen housing growth, they can still be certified as a pro-housing community. by submitting their data and having the municipal governing body pass the pro-housing resolution. So again, this puts you as a pro-housing community at the front of the line for some of these resources. I can tell you that, this is a very much welcome program, but these resources have been available already. And all the programs that I'm aware of prioritize through scoring advantages localities who work cooperatively with projects to advance them. That can be through local approvals, that can be through as of right zoning, that can be through pilots, that can be infrastructure improvements. So all of that added together means that HCR and the state want to work with localities that want to work with us. Just to round out that part of the presentation, our Office of Community Renewal is applying to HUD for an almost identical program called Pro Housing. And it's meant to provide funding towards capacity building and development planning. Some examples of that are market rate studies, market demand studies, environmental investigations, infrastructure capacity studies, development planning, homeowner and developer guidebooks, and so forth. Another aspect of that are zoning and permit efficiency projects, meaning building code studies, ordinance review and development, racial equity impact assessment, guidelines for accessibility, design guidelines for ADUs, and so forth. And finally, technology and system improvement examples. So this would be evaluations to streamline administrative zoning and permitting procedures, systems to monitor housing programs in production, digitization of permitting processes, and zoning maps. So our Office of Community Renewal intends to use some resources that are dedicated towards rural development to match this program in order to move projects forward in rural communities. So moving on to funding programs that illustrate some practices that are applicable to rural communities. I guess I have to push back on the notion that there aren't enough resources. There aren't enough resources, never. I mean, it's insatiable, but there are resources out there that I don't think have been identified yet. And so we need to raise awareness that it's not just resources that are dedicated towards rural communities. There's a whole toolbox of funding sources that aren't being implemented in rural communities because I think there isn't the knowledge or awareness of these resources of the people who can help direct them to those communities. And so we need to do a better job of getting that word out. And I'll go through some of these programs. But essentially, HCR provides funding programs that meets most needs around the state. I want to say all needs, but maybe there are some circumstances. And we're always looking to communities for the feedback of needs that aren't being met. But so I'll say conservatively, we have a funding source that will meet almost any need in almost any place. Again, I want to say everywhere, but there may not be a place that these apply to. I haven't seen it yet. And again, I'm going to share this information through Chris. So our Office of Community Renewal, I like to use this chart, which you don't need to memorize right now. But I'm just going to list the types of activities that these programs help to fund: community planning, public facilities, public infrastructure, business assistance and job creation, residential water and wastewater activities, meaning laterals, accessible modifications, single family housing rehab, rental housing rehab, manufactured home replacement, down payment assistance, rental assistance, rental project development, home buyer project development, new housing construction, emergency repairs for elderly homeowners, mixed use commercial rehabilitation, So that covers a lot, and I think that covers a lot in your localities. These are programs that can be accessed through the locality and or through a local nonprofit. So some programs I want to bring to your attention specifically. The Small Rental Development Initiative was mentioned earlier. This is available through nonprofits who have housing experience. They can apply for between $500,000 and $2 million per project. This is a zero interest loan to develop 5 to 20 units. So that is right sized to many communities, many rural communities. There's $7 million in the current round, which will probably fund about 2 projects, frankly. So any more resources that can be dedicated to this program would be welcome. And it would be for incomes of up to 80% of the median income. Another program I'd like to share with you is the +1 ADU program. ADUs, for those who don't know, is an accessory dwelling unit. So this is available through a local program administrator, which essentially is a local nonprofit that is working through and with actually the local government. There's $20 million available in the program right now. And that's going to be, there are going to be 10 awards made to local program administrators. So up to $2 million each. And homeowners apply through the local program administrator. There's no local program administrator for Columbia County right now, but my understanding is that there is a process of being able to get on the list. And the homeowners who apply have to be at or below 100% of the median income to qualify. And you can get up to $125,000 per ADU. There was some mention about manufactured homes. I don't have a lot of detail on that except to reiterate that the governor has introduced legislation to protect mobile home parks, and also that there's a replacement funding program for mobile homes, manufactured homes. A couple of other programs that I'm going to quickly run through. The Affordable Homeownership Opportunity Program. So this is a program that anybody can apply to. So that would mean for-profit developers, nonprofit developers, and so forth. But what we're looking for in this in the applicant is experience working with developing the homeowner, as well as experience developing the homeownership unit. So perhaps the local habitat chapter would be the best fit for this one in Columbia County. It's meant to fund projects of 5 to 40 units. Those units can also have an ADU attached to it, but there won't be additional funding for that ADU. And scattered site is okay. We only ask that the project as a whole hangs together to create an impact, positive impact on that neighborhood. Just some funding amount information. So up to $150,000 per unit for a homeowner at or below 100% of the median income. You can get up to $200,000 per unit for a homeowner at or below 80% of the median income. And you can add an additional $20,000 per unit if you meet net zero or passive house standards. This is a 0.5% interest only loan. And there's a 10% equity contribution for nonprofits and 5% for 10% for for-profits and 5% for not-for-profits. Moving on to another program, Rural and Urban Community Investment Fund. As the name says, it can be used and is often used in rural communities of 25,000 people and less. So the The rural aspect of this program is you can only do residential and commercial, whereas in an urban project, you can only use it for the commercial or non-residential part of the project. It's meant to fund projects of 5 to 20 units, again, right size to many rural communities. You can do new construction, you can do adaptive reuse, or you can do preservation of existing affordable housing in your community. Even in the rural projects, you can have a non-residential component. So I can imagine a downtown or Main Street type of a project where you want to develop 6 residential units over top of a commercial space. I've got this kind of project right up in Greenwich, up there in Washington County. So it's a nice component. There's a $2 million per project limit. So you can develop, $150,000 per unit for new and adaptive reuse. If there's money left over for that non-residential use, you can use that up to the $2 million. And there's $60,000 per residential unit for preservation. Another program that is for small projects that really works well in rural communities is the Small Building Participation Loan Program. Now, this was initially developed as a blight removal program, but has been expanded to include new construction and adaptive reuse. So it's a 5 to 50 unit type of program where we work with our lender partner. Right now, it's the Community Preservation Corporation. They have an office in Albany, and they will help you conceptualize your project, meaning, how many units can you afford to develop, and help you put together your budgets and then apply to HCR for the balance of the funding in the form of a subsidy. So it's a subsidy plus debt program. They will help you size the debt, and then we will plug the gap with the subsidy to make your project work. There are 2 different subsidy levels. I won't get into that, but they are dependent upon the average income of the project. So it's nice. You can have some lower income units, and then you can have some higher income units, as long as they average out below these 2 thresholds that dictate how much subsidy that you can get. And Chris, if you permit me another 2 minutes, I want to talk about our 9% low-income housing tax credit program. So this funds on average about 60 units per project. I've seen 40 units, I've seen 80 units. It depends upon the dynamics of each project. But it's often not talked about for rural communities, because rural communities, who needs 60 units, right? Well, as a matter of fact, it's being used in rural communities. And just to give you an idea of the scale of the resource compared to some of the other resources that have been mentioned, this is about a $500 million that's being made available every year through a combination of capital subsidies, which are real dollars, real taxpayer dollars, but the heavy lifting is done through the sale of low-income housing tax credits to private investors. And that has been the way that probably 95% of affordable housing has been financed and developed in the United States since the tax credit program was adopted in 1986. So I want, and this is being carried out primarily by larger developers, both for-profit and nonprofit. So we do have some rural preservation companies that, like RUPCO, like Hudson River Housing, and a few others that are utilizing this program. And wherever I have a developer who comes into town, they're not from there, they don't know it, I try to marry them up with a local nonprofit, whether it's a neighborhood improvement corporation or a rural preservation corporation, to get that local responsibility baked into, and knowledge baked into that project to make sure it goes right. So let me give you a few examples. I'm going to start by giving, a comparison to the population of Chatham, which is, I looked it up, 1,770. Galatia is 1,785. So these couple of projects I pulled have either been awarded or are actually under construction right now. Prattsville, Greene County, 774 people, residents there. 45 residential units were funded there. Corinth, Saratoga County, 60 units for a population of 2,559. Highland, Ulster County, 57 units for a population of 2,196. Lake Placid in Essex County, 60 units for a population of 2,303. Right now, our 9% tax credit application is open until November 7th. And I'll give you an example of 3 projects in rural communities. Tannersville, Greene County, population 568. 56 units are being proposed there. The workforce can't afford to live there. Glenfield, Lewis County, 52 units for a population of 1,794. They're putting an old abandoned school back to use, and this project has a veterans preference. Rhinebeck, Dutchess County, 80 units for a population of 2,697. So in wrapping up my presentation, I can't say enough that there's an abundance of resources. I think the challenge is implementation, getting the money out the door. One of the, bringing it back to Columbia County, I think, frankly, is the hole in the donut when it comes to the nonprofit community being able, housing providers implementing these programs. There are strong RPCs and NPCs in Dutchess, Ulster, Rupco serves Greene County, Albany County, Rensselaer County. So we have to work on developing the talent and the capacity in Columbia County in order to take advantage of all these programs. And also the moms and pops that I mentioned before, and the uninitiated developers. We have to deputize them. This is an all hands on deck situation. We want to provide you with the knowledge and the resources together and ask you to join in helping us solve New York's housing crisis. Again, this is a lot of information. I'm just up the road, happy to come down and meet with anybody, but I will distribute as much information through Chris as possible. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Darren. And I would be remiss, just because the timing is very serendipitous. The Village of Kinderhook is meeting tonight to discuss their recent downtown revitalization initiative award. So not only can rural towns and villages win DRIs, we have one that won a DRI this year. We are at 5:04. The nice thing about going last is that the 3 presenters in front of you very often make your points for you, so I don't need a lot of time. But there are a couple of questions I'd like to open up the floor to. There's one in the Q&A about Columbia County and RPCs that I will speak to in just a bit. But Adam, there was one specifically for you in chat that looks like you called out. So if you're ready to answer it.
Yeah, so the question was about tiny home communities made out of hemp-made products with rent with options to own. So a couple things on that. Tiny home communities, so they're possible. I mean, they weren't called tiny homes, but we built things that were analogous to that in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. What it really is smaller homes on smaller lots. The reality is the vast majority of our zoning across the entire region doesn't allow it. So if you want to think about that, first you got to understand whether the underlying rules and codes allow for it, right? And then you can pursue it once it's allowed. Second piece there is rent with options to own. This geography has nothing to do with you, but the Habitat chapter that covers New York City and Westchester, and maybe Darren can speak to this if he's familiar with it, is using some of the LIHTC programs to create rental units with the full understanding to the people who go into the rental units that there's going to be a transition of those rentals to shared equity co-op ownership over time. So that is a rent to own model, and it is a rent to own model that allows people to eventually build equity, but at a fraction of the overall cost of a typical one-family home. Again, thinking about how do we restore these typical traditional pathways from rental to home ownership to another stage of home ownership. It's kind of a unique, not unique, but it's a really strategically interesting model that's being employed by the Habitat that works at the very southern end of the state. I hope that answered your question, Caroline.
Thanks, Adam. Mike, I've got a question. I have my own question for you, if you don't mind. You touched on one of the pieces of legislation around mobile home parks that was passed in the past week. There was another piece of that. There were three. One of them I don't fully understand yet. The second one, though, is very interesting to me. Up until a week ago, mobile home park purchases were financed as if they were property, right? They were considered chattel. One of the bills that passed last week, unless I'm mistaken, now allows Sunny Mae, New York State's mortgage provider, to purchase mortgages for mobile homes and then finance them kind of through a traditional market. Is that correct, or is there some clarification needed there?
Yeah, no, that's basically the gist of it. I mean, it just makes it easier for people who want to purchase a mobile home to get financing, from a regular bank that Sunny Mae does business with, and backs it up with their support. So, it's another small step, another piece in the puzzle to making it easier for folks to purchase mobile homes. Again, people tend to look down on mobile home parks or mobile homes, but again, it is a significant source of affordable owner-occupied housing, particularly in rural communities. And we need, the state, Darren's right. The state has two different programs that one helps with replacement of mobile homes. One helps with the infrastructure inside mobile home parks. But, in terms of the number of mobile home parks, 1,800 in the state, 5 million or 4 million is really a drop in the bucket. And we need to do more. And so if we want to, again, solve our housing crisis, we need to both, build new housing, but also make an effort to preserve what we currently have. But yes, the Sunny Mae bill was one of three that the governor signed last week. Again, just makes it easier to get financing through a traditional real property, considering mobile homes as real property as opposed to personal property, which is a good step in the right direction, along with the other bill that made it easier, for residents to purchase their mobile home parks. So yes, it was a good week for mobile home parks.
Hey, Chris, if you don't mind, just to double down on something Michael said, it's important for everyone here to understand that the housing ledger has two sides of it, right? We often focus on building new. But as you build new, you may lose existing stock out the backside that is lost to dilapidation. So when you're putting together plans and looking at the housing stock in your respective communities, don't just look at opportunities to build new, look at opportunities to preserve and refurbish, because you could end up building the same number of new units that you're losing to dilapidation over time. And then you're just essentially reaching homeostasis. You haven't made any progress. You're just leveled out. So that's an important point, Michael. I wanted to underscore.
Yeah, I had 3 regional meetings this past month in October where I drove to Watkins Glen, I drove up to Batavia, and I drove to Canton, really on the Canadian border. And going through rural communities, I swear I've never seen so much dilapidated housing and disrepair. I felt like I was driving through Appalachia. It's just you're in another world, and I just feel like we need to do more to revitalize. It's like recycling. We recycle a lot. We need to start recycling some of this housing because it's just going into disrepair, and that's why people are leaving. That's why we put out a report earlier this year about the state of rural housing. The state controller put out a report on rural communities. And we're losing population. And Adam's report about the declining student population, that is very troubling because young families, young people are leaving rural communities. They're going someplace else. That's leaving us with older, more senior population in needing of more care and more supportive housing. And we just don't have it. So it's a disaster basically waiting to happen.
Thanks, Mike and Adam. There's an interesting couple of data sets that kind of tie the story together. Over 50% of the housing stock in Columbia County is over 50 years old, and so are the people. Columbia County is one of only 4 counties across the state projected to have an average age of over 55 by the year 2040, which, as I get older, is not that far away. It seems like it's a bit far away, but it'll be here before you know it. Darren, I kind of want to turn a question around a little bit that I had asked about best practices. You had mentioned capacity for rural areas, lacking things like local program administrators or other organizations that could help facilitate some of the grants. What are some best practices that rural areas that don't have a lot of homegrown capacity or extant capacity as far as creating partnerships or coalitions? What are some best practices you've seen from grant applications from kind of startup housing efforts?
Sure. Often, as I was saying, the local housing provider knows the lay of the land. They know what the housing need is. They want to address it, but they're lacking the skill set and the capacity to do that very thing. They're doing good work, but the need is much greater. They need to scale up somehow. And so what I often do is a direct developer talent towards that community and make that marriage between the for-profit developer, and sometimes it's a nonprofit, and that smaller local organization. It's the best of both worlds, and I've seen it have success in a couple places. Greene County, Essex County, these rural communities that absolutely need housing, but they don't have the capacity to access some of these more sophisticated programs. So that's what I do all the time. And mostly in the North Country, I would say, sometimes in the Mohawk Valley, but there are places in the Mid-Hudson, Sullivan County, another one, that is very, very rural and served by RPCs, and in some cases, neighborhood improvement corporations. As long as they have the will to want to do something about the problem in their community, we can help them with the rest. We can help capacity build, we can help with the technical expertise, and of course, with the financing of these projects.
Excellent, thank you. Unless anyone has any other questions for our panelists, I'm going to go through the Housing Task Force presentation, kind of what we've been up to for the past 7 months, I believe, and what we're going to be up to in early 2024. One moment. Okay, everyone can see this, right? Perfect. Okay, I may skip through some of this, just it's a little bit of review from information we've heard tonight and information if you were at the Housing Forum last year or have visited CEDC's website in the past 7 months will be available. So Columbia Economic Development Corporation, as we noted earlier, we are the local development corporation for the entire county. We are really focusing on housing as kind of an expansion of the pillars that we have for our strategic pillars. The last two, especially quality of life and sustainability, and workforce and education. It's very difficult to have a workforce if your essential employees cannot afford to live in your area. Gas isn't getting any cheaper, so it's also expensive to commute to the area. This is a snapshot of our challenges. So we've only got 6 areas throughout the county that have water and water systems, and we have 10 areas with sewer districts across 29 municipalities. So there isn't a lot of existing infrastructure. As I mentioned, our housing stock is old and getting older. And as Adam really astutely mentioned, there's a lot of housing leak of buildings that aren't preserved, homes that aren't preserved, and there are programs out there to obviate that or mitigate that. Median home sales price have increased 67%. That is last year's number. It is now up to 70% as of the new statistic that our area median price is $465,000. And available homes have decreased even a little bit more. So it was 62%, and now it's closer to 2/3, a little above 2/3. Almost half of our renters are housing cost burden, which means they spend more than 30% of their gross income on rents. And then 22% are severely cost burden, which means they spend more than half of their income on rent. So the housing activities that we've been doing in the past few years as kind of a run up to where we are now and where we're going in the future. In 2017, there was a housing needs assessment that focused both on the city of Hudson and the county at large. There were recommendations made from that. Following that, was the Pattern for Progress housing brief in 2022, which was presented in 2022 at the first housing forum. Recommendations from that were all followed for the most part. Establish a housing task force, check. Hire a housing development coordinator, we've checked that off. And one of the other recommendations was to support a nonprofit housing organization such as the Community Land Trust or Housing Trust Fund, the Housing Task Force, in alignment with a steering committee of residents from throughout the county, spearheaded by Michelle Tullo, who is the City of Hudson's Housing Justice Director. That group has made a lot of inroads towards formally becoming an organization. Bylaws are just about done. Articles of incorporation should be in by the end of this year. So there's another one of the recommendations that is in the pipe. And then most recently, the county CEDC and the Housing Task Force combined to develop an application to create a land bank in New York State. We'll talk a little bit more about how that's going and what a land bank is. So really briefly, I just want to zip through this. The 2017 housing needs assessment was really, here's where you are, here's some demographics, here's the projections for your county for the next few years. This is what your housing need is going to look like. Recommendations that came from that, you'll see reflected again. There's a reason you see these over and over again. These are really good recommendations. Preserve your housing stock. Adam talked about that at length. Enhance housing and amenities throughout downtowns. Darren mentioned that as part of the Main Street programs, the Downtown Revitalization Initiative. Improve building code enforcement throughout all of our towns and villages. We don't have a good solution for that yet, but we're working on it. Code enforcement in rural areas is really, really difficult. You know, some of our building permit employees work in 4 different towns at once. And then the last piece was to create additional good quality mixed income housing. And we'll talk about how that's going. Following in that was the 2022 housing brief. Again, a snapshot of the current housing market. If you'll notice, between 2017 and 2022, we had a fairly significant event that impacted a lot of areas of life, certainly housing in the Hudson Valley region and Columbia County specifically. The recommendations very similar to the housing needs assessment. Again, support small incremental development of rental housing. We talk a lot about home ownership, but rental housing is equally important throughout the county. And again, improve and preserve the existing housing stock, increase home ownership opportunities, and raise awareness and educate, which really became important at the outset of the Housing Task Force's work. We'll talk about that in a second. The brief was presented at last year's housing forum. So these are the 4 key recommendations from the first housing forum, which happened last March. So we have created the countywide housing task force. Supervisors Brenda Adams and Ron Knott are our co-chairs. Their leadership and their insight has been invaluable. We hired and managed a housing development coordinator, that's me. Develop a county infrastructure master plan. We took a little bit of a different angle on that, and I'll talk about that. Darren touched on this a little bit. So my definition of infrastructure in this particular aspect is going to be a little bit different than I think the traditional definition. And then the last one was to sponsor and or promote a countywide housing nonprofit, which we've done. So our response to date, created the task force, hired me. When we started the task force, we broke out into 3 different committees: outreach, policy, and pre-development. Outreach became really important really early. And this kind of goes back to the housing brief's recommendation to increase awareness. There are still misconceptions about who needs affordable housing or just who benefits from subsidized housing, workforce housing, whatever you'd like to call it. We talk a lot about AMI, area median income. That 80% threshold is where a lot of programs kind of stop, or where a lot of programs are centered. Past that, you've still got people that are making 100% of the median income for your area that are still having a really hard time affording any kind of housing throughout the region. So really kind of heightening that awareness that it's literally people like me. There's a cohort of folks called ALICE. This is an acronym that means Asset Limited Income Constrained Employed. It's a bit of a mouthful. Basically what it means is these are folks who are working. They have what you would consider a competitive salary or competitive income for the region, don't have assets because they likely don't own land. These are folks who can afford to maybe rent in the region, but cannot afford to rent and simultaneously save up for a down payment on a home that may not exist because the stock has been depleted so much. So once we broke out to the committees, the real work began. CEDC submitted an application on behalf of the Community Land Trust effort that's been starting up. That application was approved by HCR. So that was a startup grant for planning funds. The Board of Supervisors asked CEDC and the Housing Task Force to look into creating a land bank. We submitted the application in early October. And there's so much housing momentum and positive news happening throughout the county that on the same day that I was on the phone listening to the meeting at which the land bank was approved, standing next to Adam, while we were at an event hearing about how Alblandia and Columbia County Habitat for Humanity were the recipients of $1.5 million in line item grant funding from the state. So there's so much good news that some of it is literally happening at the same time. So the land bank application was approved. It's been approved by the second of 3 agencies that need to sign off on it. So we should be in business within the next few weeks. And also, as part of our outreach, we circulated a survey to employers throughout the county. We very often hear about how employers are being affected by housing issues. We very rarely hear directly from employers about how they're being impacted by housing issues. That survey's been out for a week. After 7 days, we have a 5% response rate, which doesn't sound great. Let me tell you, in the survey world, if you're at 5% after 7 days, that's really good. We will recirculate that, kind of send out a reminder to hopefully boost that, but we've got a pretty good sample of responses from which to base some decisions. So what is a land bank? We've created the land bank. I co-created a land bank in the city of Troy back in 2014, was its director of operations for 4 or 5 years. Sometimes I get a little myopic about what these are and how they can be used. Land banks are essentially tools. The state allowed the creation of land banks in 2011. Initially, 26 could operate throughout the state. Over the course of the past few years, land banks have been such a positive, powerful force throughout the state that the state raised that cap to 35. The reason why there's a cap on how many land banks can operate throughout the state is that, yes, they are nonprofits, but they hold powers, legal powers, that need to be authorized by the state. So the state needs to actually sign off on the creation of land banks so that they can then inherit those powers. They are traditionally used to return vacant, abandoned, and especially tax foreclosed properties to productive use. But land banks are incredibly flexible tools. The funding can be used for pretty much anything that fits into a land bank's mission statement and their area of influence. Many of the first land banks were started in urban areas that have been hit hard by the 2008 foreclosure crisis. Other land banks were started specifically to deal with brownfields. Some land banks were started specifically to deal with affordable housing. Many of the land banks that were not created to deal with affordable housing have pivoted to deal with affordable housing. That's become their main mission statement. We see the land bank in Columbia County acting as a hub. As has been mentioned a couple of times, I think Darren really hit the nail on the head here. There isn't an existing infrastructure of organizations in the county dealing with housing issues that you see either across the river or up or down the river. It seems like every other county around us has a fairly robust network of organizations, but we're not quite there yet. So we see the land bank as being the hub, kind of the center of what will become a network of organizations, hopefully that we entice or just build from scratch. Whichever is easiest and most efficient is the way that we will progress. Just a snapshot of land banks and their history throughout the state. You can see the map on the left shows you all of the areas that are serviced by land banks. If there's an entire section that's colored in, that's a countywide land bank. Then the small dots are municipal land banks. This has 26 land banks in New York State. We are now at 29 after Columbia County's approval. So there have been 3 just in the past 2 years that have been approved by Empire State Development. The other organization that the Housing Task Force is supporting the creation of is a Community Land Trust. Community Land Trust, I really like the top. There are quite a few infographics about CLTs. I like this one a lot. The community's essential workforce in your area. These are folks employed in public safety, healthcare, education, local government, just a few examples of really vital occupations that exist in our county. Power the local economy, but can be priced out of housing near their workplace, public transportation, and schools. So CLTs are organizations that hold land on behalf of the community, and then any improvement building that is on the land is privately owned. So the CLT retains some sort of interest in the property in perpetuity, enters into a 99-year ground lease with the homeowner. And then there's a resale formula that enables that property to then be affordable in perpetuity. As the property is sold, it is sold to another income qualifying individual so that the subsidy in that property is reinvested time and time again. The other really nice thing about CLTs is that they are not tied to just homeownership. They are definitely vehicles for homeownership, and that's how many of them are geared. But a lot of CLTs, there's a community land trust in Albany that's been in existence for 30 years. Their portfolio is almost 50-50 housing and rental. And the reason that they do that is renting is still very important. It creates that continuity or that continuum of housing that Adam was talking about. And in real kind of nuts and bolts terminology, their rental income subsidizes a lot of the subsidies that they have on the housing side. So this is a little bit about how CLTs work. So you've got a new buyer purchases the house, leases land from the CLT. They'll pay a minimal lease fee to the CLT. These are as low as $5 a month. This is just to keep the ground lease cooking. And then when they resell the home, they do capture a piece of the equity. So in this example, and these numbers are relatively made up. They're just numbers to see how the formula works. In this example, this is someone who purchased their home for $160,000. After 5 years, they can sell it for whatever the amount is that's appreciated, that's capped by the resale formula. They walk away with half the equity, and the CLT walks away with the other half. Really, the point of comparison for CLT homes is not traditional homeownership models, it's rental. Most people that are getting into CLTs are first-time home buyers. Some CLTs only sell to first-time home buyers. As a lifelong rental tenant, I can tell you that at best, I walk away with my deposit. It's not really a way to build equity for future purchases. So this is a way that someone gets a seat at the table. So I've talked about the employer survey a bit. We started to get, we've got 44 responses back after the first week. I'm very excited that we got such a wide variety of employers represented. These are the occupation categories of the respondents. The only one that's really kind of an outlier is the arts and entertainment cohort here. The rest are pretty well distributed. So we got a really good cross-section of the types of employers, but they are united in the extent to which they're concerned about housing. So of the 44 respondents, nearly 70% have said that they are significantly concerned about housing. So this is, these are kind of words that we've been putting in employers' mouths, but it's very good to have them confirmed. This is kind of the real nuts and bolts of the survey. So we asked, how does housing affordability affect your business and or your employees directly? Recruiting new employees was almost unanimous. Close to 90% of respondents mentioned that recruiting new employees was really difficult, which is interesting because that to me implies that you need to rely on some degree of in-migration. But as we've seen, the in-migration that we're getting is basically replacing our workforce. If you look at the numbers just for Columbia County over the past 10 years, almost for every person we've lost between the ages of 25 and 45, we've picked up somebody over the age of 55. So our workforce is increasingly being replaced by semi-retired folks or just retired folks. And then retaining current employees and employees commuting long distances, because the next most available area is really this connect to the Albany-Troy metro area. Those were the next two big concerns for the employers. So that's what we've been up to this past year. What we're up to for the rest of this year and looking forward into next year. The Housing Toolbox resource was the most popular aspect of the Housing Task Force when we first started. That is something that we're putting together, and we want to put that together in a way that it makes sense for communities, for localities. So that's not just a list of, here's a bunch of concepts about housing, have at it. So we're trying to build that in a way that that's a conversation, it's dialogue, it's a useful tool for communities instead of just an index of terms that they may or may not be aware of. Following the employer housing survey, a really difficult cohort to get to, or that's very underrepresented when you talk about housing in any kind of area, the folks who work in your communities but don't live in your communities. They don't show up to meetings because they don't live in your towns. They may not know that meetings are happening. They don't know who to talk to about these issues. So we're hoping that circulating a survey that is kind of targeted to employees will catch a lot of folks who don't currently live in the county but would like to if they could. We expect the land bank and the community land trust to incorporate and begin operating within the next few months. Following that, both of those entities will submit applications for state and federal grants. As Darren alluded to, we don't have a lot of organizations in the county that are even qualified to submit applications for state and federal grants in the area of housing. So having two that are coming online pretty much side by side is a huge value add. We will explore short-term rental strategies. This is something that's been percolating in the county for a few years. I know going back at least 5 years, this was a conversation at the County Board of Supervisors level. There's a bit of a wait and see attitude to see what was going to happen at the state level with STR registration. It hasn't really gone anywhere, unfortunately. And many counties throughout the state have kind of taken this into their own hands and are imposing hotel and occupancy tax on Airbnbs. Short-term rentals came up the most in the employer survey, kind of fill in the blank responses about what are some of the housing challenges throughout the county. This next one gets back to the question in Q&A that was for me about RPCs. We probably won't be able, this year is when the RFP is available for creating a new RPC. We don't have organizations that are ready to apply for it. You have to demonstrate 1 year of capacity and 1 year of experience of managing certain programs. Basically, you apply to become an RPC because you've already been doing the things that qualify you to be an RPC. So what we're hoping to do, using Land Bank as a hub, is to either enter into service contracts with neighboring RPCs who are currently active in other counties and having them establish a foothold in Columbia County so that we don't need to create something from scratch. We can just invite them to partner with us. And then to get back to the infrastructure study, that was the fourth recommendation that is as yet unfulfilled. We're going to look for funding to conduct a build-out feasibility analysis. This is a pretty high-level document that takes a look at sites throughout your communities throughout the county. With what are the easiest places to build? How much could you build there? What do you need if building there isn't currently feasible? 2024 will be even busier, so there are more things. So we will have a developers forum. Darren mentioned a couple times bringing developers into rural areas and connecting them with organizations. We don't really have a lot of organizations to connect with since we'll have a couple starting up next year. That's when we think having developers forum makes the most sense. I'll be knocking on your door, Darren, to help us make that happen. Shovel-ready site audit is tied to the feasibility study, the build-out study. Creating a grants pipeline, what that gets to is some of these programs you need to demonstrate need before you can really have a competitive application. That includes a lot of CDBG home repair programs, the home repair programs. I've spoken to a couple of people that have gone through the ADU +1 program. Same story. They had a kind of a bench strength of folks that were interested in that program because you need to already be a homeowner before you can apply for the grant. Looking at a housing trust fund. So the city of Hudson has a housing trust fund. Dutchess County recently created a housing trust fund. This basically replaces a line item in a county or a city or a town's budget that would be for affordable housing. You just have this revolving fund. That's the important part, is the revolving fund. There's a revolving fund year after year that can be made, loans can be made, grants can be made from it, but you need to have some way to refill that. Short-term rental regulations is one potential possibility for that. We are currently working on a grant in conjunction with Greene County. When I say we, I mean CEDC. We're working on a grant in conjunction with Greene County for, it's a brownfield assessments grant. So it's not for remediation, but this is a grant that will allow both of our counties to identify where are brownfields, and brownfields are previously contaminated sites. Typically there's some kind of industrial use at these properties, and they're now deemed by the Department of Environmental Conservation to be brownfields, which means you shouldn't be there. So we're looking to identify all the brownfields in the county, or at least the ones that are low-hanging fruit. What's the nature, what's the extent of the contamination, what can be done for remediation. If we do win that grant, then we'll be able to pursue further grants to actually remediate those properties, and hopefully some can be used for housing. CEDC and the Housing Task Force will continue to provide technical support to communities once we have a couple of partners. We talk about rural preservation companies. We talk about, Brupco and Hudson River Housing have been mentioned a few times. Entering into partnerships with those organizations who have been doing work in this area for decades will allow us to expand the services that we can offer to our local communities. Darren mentioned the Pro Housing Communities program. We've worked with a couple of towns already to get their letters of intent and orders and start to work through their building permit surveys, just to kind of tee up those communities for the next grants that will be coming out most likely in the spring, that if you have Pro Housing Communities designation, you'll kind of move to the front of the line. This last piece is just stay ready for unexpected opportunities. You don't have to get ready if you stay ready. So there are a lot of things that have come up in the past 7 months that we didn't anticipate. So we want to remain flexible, but you really can't respond quickly to opportunities unless you've got the organizational infrastructure in place. So you know who's doing what and who can partner with who to really create powerful coalitions to create some sort of change. So that was a quick zip through. I do see a couple of things in chat that I didn't get to, so there we go. Questions in chat. How does a community get qualified to submit an application? Is this a pro-housing communities question?
So sorry, I'm new to this.
That's fine.
But New Lebanon is striving to become a pro-housing community. So again, I'm probably missing the forest for the trees because there's so many things you probably have to do to get qualified. But I'm just wondering if there's some sort of checklist or, you know, crisp beginning point or something that would help us get on board, especially with what Darren was saying about there being money on the table and many smaller communities not actually being able to tap into it. So, you know, anything you could send out that's sort of concrete would be really helpful.
Luckily, New Lebanon specifically is pretty ahead of the game.
Okay.
Supervisor Holding is in the chat, providing a real-time update of what's going on with your application. It's actually, HCR did a really good job rolling this out. It's at first blush, when you see it, it looks like a lot. Once you really get down into it, there are 2 things you need to do. Submit a letter of intent, and then one of 2 paths. If you've got to do a building permit survey to see where you're at for new units added. If you're at the number that you need to be, which is actually fairly low for the past year, it just needs to be 1/3 of 1% of an increase in units. Over the past 3 years, it needs to be a full percent. Many of our communities are already at that threshold. So if you've not hit that, you need to pass a resolution stating that you would like to hit those numbers, and then you go from there. You submit those to HCR, and they'll contact you and walk you through it. But it's not that bad. It's much less Byzantine than other state programs have been in the past. What else do we have? Oh, do we have no other questions in chat? That would be amazing. Oh, Brenda, you have a question about mobile home funding. That has been answered, it looks like. Okay, perfect. The best places to go for housing project RFPs. Ooh. I'm going to ask, could I get a little clarification on that if you're willing to speak up?
Sure. We are an architecture firm that does a lot of affordable housing in New York City, and of course, we're looking for other opportunities as well too in any place that needs affordable housing. So what we want to do is either connect with organizations like nonprofits that are looking to build more affordable housing and are looking for assistance in creating those plans and even starting from the land acquisition and anything concerning zoning assistance and getting variances and things like that. We're looking to connect with organizations that are looking for that kind of help.
Yeah, one of the big challenges in our county is there aren't a lot of organizations that own land that are looking for developers. Habitat for Humanity is ready to go. They broke ground on, shout out to Habitat, 30-year anniversary. Just won Habitat Restore of the Year for New York State. And then the aforementioned $1.5 million grant, but also broke ground on 2 homes in Philmont this year. Habitat has a model that can be adapted for most of our rural towns and communities. There are some zoning questions here and there, but their big challenge is land acquisition. So that was one of the primary reasons that we created the land bank. That's a land acquisition tool that is pretty powerful. And then on the CLT side, that's another, not as powerful as a land acquisition tool, but incredibly powerful as a community influence tool, community interest tool, and also as a purveyor, a disposition side. So land bank does the acquisition, CLTs do the disposition. So we're creating that infrastructure. Right now, I think probably the only housing RFPs you'll see in our county are most likely going to be in the city of Hudson. You might see some in Philmont sometimes. Philmont is an interesting case. It's a 2/3 rental base in Philmont. They have some infrastructure there for rental. But again, a lot of their rental stock is aging and needs repair. So I think you might see a lot of RFPs for rehab in the coming months, as well as new build. Let's see if I got any more.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Supervisor Hoatling wants to hear more about how towns join the land trust. You don't need to. That's not really a thing that you sign up for. So the CLT will be actually, is Michelle, are you on the call still? I lost Michelle too. Okay. So CLTs are members, this particular CLT, Trillium CLT, will be a membership organization, but towns don't need to become members. Basically, if there's a parcel in your town that is either donated to the CLT or the CLT acquires it through whatever variety of means they acquire it, your town will have an outsized influence on the development of that parcel. CLTs are there to, they're stewards of land on behalf of the local community. So it's not something that you would need to sign up for, but it's something that, if you've got a housing advisory board, or if you're New Lebanon, you've got a quality of life committee, they will certainly have input on what gets developed on that parcel. All right, there's nothing more in Q&A. We are a little bit over. It looks like we are done. So everyone that registered tonight, I will circulate a link to the Housing Task Force YouTube page so you can watch this presentation and prior ones if you are so inclined. And then I'll make available all of the links that were shared in chat, and then all of the presentations that you saw tonight. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Chris.
Great job, Chris. Thank you.